Do you love spy books, movies, and TV? Then the Spybrary podcast is for you. Since 2017, host Shane Whaley and Spybrary field agents around the world dispatch reviews and interviews with authors, historians, and fellow spy fans. We discuss everything from John le Carré, Len Dayton, Paul Vidic, Graham Greene, Mick Herron, Charles Cumming, Ben McIntyre, and many more. Spybrary is available on all good podcast apps and at spybrary.com.
Welcome to the Spybrary podcast. My name is David Clark. I'm a member of the Spybrary community, and I'll be your host for today's episode. I'm pleased to be joined by our guest author, Charles Beaumont, which is the pen name, or should I say cover identity, of a former MI6 officer whose debut novel, A Spy Alone, has just been published in the UK. So welcome, Charles.
Thank you. Pleasure to be with you.
I should say before we start that in order to maintain Charles's cover, his voice is being digitally altered, which I think will make this the first Spybrary podcast to feature actual tradecraft, which I know will amuse some of you. So, Charles, let's talk about A Spy Alone first. I really enjoyed this book, and the things that I took away from it, it's very fresh and of the moment. It's located right in the midst of a major international crisis and the events that have led up to it. And also very politically relevant, I think, specifically for the UK in describing the UK's political condition and its vulnerability to Russian interference in our democratic affairs. So I thought really it's the only book I've read that has done that in such an effective way. Could you, just without any spoilers, describe generally the themes of the book and as much of the plot as you can do without giving away too much?
Yeah, well, David, what I've tried to do with this book is to explore what it would be like if there were a Russian spy ring operating now in this contemporary era in Britain. And clearly, listeners of this podcast will be well aware of the history of the Philby and Blunt and all those people back in the Cold War. And I think I'm always fascinated by those stories and, of course, the literature that comes off them. Some of John le Carré's greatest books are all wonderful, high points in spy literature. But I suppose I felt that that is very much a Cold War framing. And we are living in an age of Russian interference, of a lot of cynicism in our politics, and a post-ideological age. And I wanted to explore sort of whether such a phenomenon could be repeated in the modern era. And to the extent that this is fiction, I think I've sort of illustrated that. In terms of the basic plot, Simon Sharman is the protagonist. He's a former intelligence officer. He is pursuing a not very successful career in the private sector. And he starts what he believes is a sort of routine due diligence inquiry on behalf of a foundation looking into a big donation that's going to go to an Oxford college. As his work continues, he realizes that there's much more going on, and this effectively leads him on a pathway to uncovering this spy ring. And there's a lot of flashbacks to Oxford. The protagonist himself was a student at Oxford, and so it, as well as being a novel about a contemporary spy ring, it's a novel about an Oxford spy ring. And of course, people know about the Cambridge spy ring back in the Cold War, and there's always been speculation as to whether there was an Oxford spy ring. And so, and again, I'm trying to sort of play with that idea, hopefully to the reader's enjoyment.
Yeah, one of the things I really took away from the book was the difference between Russian interference now and during the Cold War, and the motives of those who, from the Western end, collaborate with it to some extent or another. And you brought out, I think, very effectively the political complexity of it now compared to what it was like in the past. Obviously, in the Soviet era, those who collaborated with the Soviet intelligence services either did it in the early period, certainly for ideological reasons mainly, and later for more mercenary means. But it's much more complex now. And you convey, I think, the sense that people like Trump and others who align themselves to some extent or another with Russia, they do so because they think that they're using Russia as much as Russia is using them. And I wonder if you could say a little bit more about that and how that relates to the way, in particular in the UK, that Russia operates and how it successfully manages to influence our political affairs.
Yeah, well, I think you sort of put your finger on it there in terms of we are in this post-ideological age, and clearly there's nothing about modern Russia that would lead a sort of ordinary person to look at it and think, well, I think this country is wonderful and I want to follow their vision for the future, which was in some cases, what was happening in the Cold War. But there are cynical people who have a particular worldview, who think that they can cooperate with Russia and in so doing pursue their own objectives. And we see this in all kinds of, and I'm not talking about the novel now, this is in real life, we see this in all kinds of areas. So whether or not Trump himself was actively cooperating with Russia, it's absolutely clear that people in his team were doing that. And there are, examples across Europe of the Russians, giving money to national sort of populist political parties. In Britain, there are lots of examples of people, for example, helping Russian oligarchs pursue journalists, whether it's lawyers or sort of PR types. There are the bankers that are helping the Russian kleptocrats launder their money. And as part of that, there is definitely Russian influence in our politics. And that, that's been unpeeled. Most famously, the Intelligence Services Committee report, I think the so-called Russia report, which of course was sat on in this country. It wasn't published for several years, possibly because it embarrassed a lot of people in power.
Ideology still plays a role, though. I mean, I'm interested by your choice of the word post-ideological, because it's a comment that I hear a lot, and although I understand what you mean by that, ideology does, to some extent, play a role. I mean, even in a sense, some of the characters in your book, it's quite clear that they share with Russia a certain outlook. It's sovereigntist, it's nationalist, it's against liberal democracy, it's against what's now become known as woke, any idea of anything that's socially progressive. It's traditionalist in its outlook, believes in traditional values. It's sort of counter-Enlightenment, sort of politics, which has kind of re-emerged in the West in quite a serious way for the first time since the 1930s. That's all part of the background. Of course, there are other people, and these also feature in your book, who really just only ever see a world of power and wish to align with power and money, which is for them a sort of avatar of power, and are extremely cynical. So it's a much more complex interplay of factors and motives that we're dealing with compared to the Cold War. Is that also how you see it?
Yeah, definitely. And I think I agree with you. Ideology is important, but in a way, what you don't find is necessarily ideology on a spectrum. Historically, you'd expect people on the hard left to be more sympathetic to Russia or the Soviet Union, and people on the sort of conservative right to be much more, skeptical. Well, what we see now is some people on the hard left who continue to argue that, for example, Ukraine is a fascist country and, Russia is somehow doing a great service to humanity by invading it. To be clear, I think that's rubbish. But also you see people on the hard right who, as you say, align with this kind of very national sovereigntist outlook that Putin has, the idea that conservative family values are something that Russia supports. Intriguingly, Russia has re-embraced Orthodox Christianity. And again, for people who embrace a very sort of conservative social outlook, they find that attractive as well. So you see this, you see certain types of ideology finding it easy to align with Russia. And it's very interesting. And if we look at the Republican Party in the US, very reluctant to commit to supporting Ukraine at the moment. And a lot of that appears to be a sort of emanation of this tendency. But there's a question, well, maybe Russia could be our friends in this world. Maybe Russia has values that we can align ourselves with, which of course is, if you think about where the Republicans were during the Cold War, it's an almost unbelievable transformation.
Yes, I mean, I often wonder what Ronald Reagan would make of the Republican Party today. You're right. The characters in the book are very vivid. I was so impressed by the way that you described the characters. It's full of really vivid descriptions of characters and their portrayal. In particular, Professor Mackenzie, who's at the center of this web of conspiracy, and his protege, Rory Goff, who achieves a significance right towards the end of the book. And what I liked was that, although these were the sort of counterpoints to the worldview of the protagonist, they were at the heart of this plot. They're not two-dimensional baddies. They're coherent characters with a worldview that is recognizable, and that's far more effective and unsettling, actually, I think, than just having, two-dimensional baddies who are a foil for the protagonist. So that was good. And I wonder whether you could say a little bit more about the characters. I mean, some of them are quite recognizable, at least as character types, and possibly even as actual individuals to some extent. But I just wonder how these characters formed in your head.
All novelists will say, that nobody's based on anyone, but we all respond to the people we've known in our lives and the people we know about. I mean, I think we do live in an era of very sort of cynical political operatives. And we live in an era where it appears that certain sorts of people can make lots of money and sort of swan around the political world, and really nothing seems to touch them. And they have sort of huge influence. They come and go from number 10 Downing Street and that sort of thing. And so I wanted to sort of build someone like that as a key person in this novel. But again, as you say, these people aren't simply baddies, because of course they're responding to the society in which we live. You mentioned Professor Mackenzie, Peter Mackenzie. So he is, he's a sort of washed up Oxford Don, but he's also highly influential. He writes newspaper opinion columns. He's got the sort of various editors and politicians at his beck and call. Again, I think that's a character that a lot of people can sort of recognize, even if it's not a specific individual. And another thing I sought to do, the protagonist, he is not a superhero, and there's the James Bond archetype and there's the George Smiley archetype. But I think my protagonist may not even be a George Smiley archetype. He has to depend on people that he can work with. And I wanted that to me was an important part of the book, because, intelligence work is normally teamwork. The sort of the lone genius figuring everything out, I don't think is very realistic. So that we have another professor, Sarah Dukan, who's this very sort of, well, I hope, intriguing and gifted Russian linguist. And in a way, she's sort of the brains of the book, almost more than the main character.
The portrayal of your former service and the British intelligence services generally in this book is not particularly flattering. I think it's accurate in the sense that they come across as really quite disengaged from this issue. It's reflected, of course, in the Russia report produced by the Intelligence and Security Committee in Parliament, which showed in 2016 that British intelligence services were not on the ball in spotting Russian interference and were really, after that point, playing catch-up. So I wonder whether you think the Russia report's findings revealed shortcomings in British intelligence operations. Secondly, whether you think there are other things that could and should have been done or can still be done to counter Russian interference, and whether you think the intelligence services have, as a result of the criticisms contained in the Russia report and elsewhere, upped their game since and are doing better in dealing with this issue.
Yeah, well, I won't pretend I've got an insight on, what's happening inside these organizations right now, but I think clearly a massive change occurred when Russia started its full-scale invasion of Ukraine. That's a transformational moment. And in a way that showed the validity of the points being made in the Russia report, which was that we had not taken this threat seriously enough. Certainly, I think it's a valid observation to make. Now, where I think it's important to separate out, there's the question of whether or not our intelligence services had good information and intelligence about what the Russians were plotting to do and, their methodology and so on. And of course, being on the outside, I can't judge that. But what they clearly were not doing was identifying the ways in which Russia was using its influence to corrupt our politics, to corrupt our media, to corrupt our professions. And that has been a very significant feature, I think, of the kind of post-Cold War story with Russia. That Londongrad, as everyone's familiar with, became a preferred place for people to live, to spend their money, to launder their money. Talk about Chelsea Football Club. For years, no one could say publicly anything about that, for fear of being sued by Abramovich's people. And of course, that meant British lawyers who would have been doing that for him. Now he's been sanctioned, he's had to give it up. So it's not in doubt that he was operating basically very close to, or maybe on behalf of, Putin. So the last part of your question, what should happen? I think we may need different structures, because Russia's not the only country that does this. A lot of countries seek to take advantage of our open society, basically use money and other methodologies to sort of interfere in our political structures and in other sort of influence operations. In Australia, they have a sort of separate organisation that exists to deal with those things. It's not clear to me that between the police and the security services and other bits of the British state, we are really structured to deal with that. And, there's Russia, there's China, there are countries in the Gulf region and further afield. We should probably take it a lot more seriously.
And to what do you attribute the failure, really, at the early stages of this to focus on it? Is it simply a question of being distracted by other priorities, budget constraints, or is it more structural in the sense that the intelligence services really are a bit squeamish about involving themselves in things that they consider to be domestic political affairs? And if so, how can that be addressed?
Yeah, well, I think, there's been a very interesting case study with Boris Johnson's relationship with the Lebedev family. Now, I should clarify, I have no reason to believe that, there was some kind of an intelligence operation going on there, because I don't know. But you can see how difficult it is when you have a foreign secretary who dispenses with his security detail and goes off to a kind of fairly sort of lurid event in a villa in Italy hosted by a former KGB officer. That is very, very difficult for unelected, rather anonymous civil servants. That's what intelligence officers are, to deal with. So that's one aspect. I think one is complacency, but I think there are a lot of interest groups in the well-off middle classes in Britain. A lot of these people are doing very well from a system which takes kleptocrats' money, it may not be just Russian money, and launders it through our financial system, and then also provides ancillary services, legal, PR, estate agency, private education. There's a whole superstructure which exists to enable this. So whilst that's not a large number of people, it's a large number of very influential and well-connected people whose livelihoods depend on that.
That's certainly true. Can I ask now, and this will interest Spybrarians, what your literary influences have been? What inspired you to write? Was it something that you'd always planned to do, or was this something that occurred to you during your period as an intelligence officer, or does it post-date that?
I think it post-dates that. Like a lot of people, the experience of COVID made me think about whether, I could turn my hand to this because the sort of enforced inactivity and so on. But I've always felt that I had a novel in me. I think everyone says that. And I've certainly, I've been heavily sort of influenced by particularly John le Carré, but there's a sort of pantheon of great spy writers who I've sort of been heavily influenced by. And again, the death of John le Carré, not for a moment am I suggesting that I was going to take his place, or far from it, but simply it sort of spurred me to think more seriously about, if you are going to write a novel, you've got to do it sometime. So it got me moving.
What about your literary inspirations? Have you been an avid reader for a long time? Are your tastes genre specific or broader than that? Which authors have influenced you, do you think?
Yeah, well, so in addition to le Carré, I think in the genre, I think Len Deighton's brilliant. I think in a way, actually, he sometimes captures the kind of the atmosphere and culture of the sort of British state even better than le Carré, which is amazing. I mean, Deighton's such a fascinating character, never worked in any kind of official capacity. I mean, he has all these other talents as an artist and a journalist and so on. But I think particularly the sort of Game, Set and Match trilogy are phenomenal works. I would say that I've enjoyed quite a lot of books in a sort of broader bit of the genre. I love that sort of more adventurous style of someone like John Buchan. Forsyth, I think, writes very well. And then I like those ones who are not scared to be funny. I think Mick Herron is brilliant in that way. Often spy literature takes itself a bit too seriously. There's another writer, a bit less well known. She's writing in the contemporary era, Alex Finley, former CIA officer, and she writes sort of spoofs, basically. And I just find them, they're very amusing, but they're, as funny books can be, they're still very revealing. I've not come across
those. I must look those up. Yeah,
Alex Finley. There's a series of books where the character is Victor, so it's Victor in trouble, Victor in various other scrapes and so on. I can recommend them. Yeah, and then there's two American writers, I think, are perhaps less well-known, particularly on this side of the pond, but really worth looking at. So there's a guy called Robert Little who wrote The Company, which is a big sort of epic novel about the CIA, really, really fascinating. And then David Ignatius, who, again, is quite well-known, writes thrillers, also writes op-eds in the Washington Post, I think. But his book called Agents of Innocence is a novel which I think is one of the best sort of books ever written about the craft of spying.
I'm about to read Agents of Innocence, so I'm interested in your take on it, but I haven't read any David Ignatius yet. Robert Little, however, is a great favourite of mine. I read The Debriefing earlier on this year, and it's a wonderful book. I'm going to make it one of my reading goals for next year to read more of his books. One of the things I really liked about his style of writing is the humanism and the warmth of his portrayal of characters, which is really quite special and different. And you also, I think, successfully do that in your book. I think your characters are really well developed and rounded in a similar way. But, I'm interested, you've picked a couple of American authors because there is a conceit that somehow the Brits have cornered the market in cerebral spy fiction. And I think that's really wide of the mark. When you look at Robert Little, you look at authors like Charles McCarry and Alan First. I read my first Alan First book a few weeks ago. It's terrific. The quality of the prose is really unique and high. So, Alan First, is he another author you've tried?
Actually, I have to admit, I've not read any of his, but I mean, in terms of, I think American writers in this genre definitely, particularly in recent years, and of course we've got, as I.S. Berry and David McCloskey, both former CIA officers who've both published brilliant books, Damascus Station and then The Peacock and the Sparrow by I.S. Berry, which I've just read, and I thought that was very good, and it really evoked the world of the Middle East, and particularly at the sort of height of the Arab Spring and all the sort of chaos and conflict that came out of it. I thought it was a fabulous book. But in terms of my own influences, I would say I am as much influenced by books in the sort of general literature rather than spy books. I grew up in a household where we're too snobbish to allow things like John le Carré onto the shelves. So I only came to le Carré relatively late in life. But, I think I'm very influenced by the type of writer that is playful and you never quite, the sort of unreliable narrator type. And of course, this goes all the way back to Jonathan Swift, Lawrence Stern, people like that. And then obviously more recently, I think, E.M. Forster to some extent, William Gaddis, who's a great American writer, I think underappreciated. And some people call it postmodernism, it's terribly pretentious. But I guess the thing about spy literature is that you don't know whether the character is telling you the truth, and that's sort of part of the point of it. And John le Carré's Our Game is a great case study of that, where throughout the book there's this sort of description of a moment which the main character apparently, an action the main character took. I'm trying to avoid spoilers. And throughout the book, you don't really know if this is a real memory or a kind of falsified one. And I think Our Game is really one of le Carré's best books, actually.
Are you on the hunt for your next thrilling spy read? Look no further. Spybrary contributor and Sunday Times chief political commentator Tim Shipman has curated a list of his top 125 spy authors ranked. With Tim's vast experience and expertise in politics and spy thrillers, you can trust his judgment on the best spy authors of all time. This list includes both classic and modern writers, making it the ultimate guide for any spy fan. But wait, there's more. Tim also recommends which book to try first from each author, and he shares his favourite book from each of them too, so you can dive right into the best of the best. Ready to get your hands on Tim's list? Head over to spybrary.com/top125 to grab your free copy now. Don't miss out on the ultimate spy reading list. Visit spybrary.com/top125 today.
Do you have a preference for era or setting when reading spy novels? A lot of the members of the Spybrary community have quite strong preferences for Cold War or Second World War or post-Cold War. Does it make a difference to you, or is a good spy story just a good spy story?
I mean, I think in general, a good spy story can work in any setting. I can sort of understand that what makes the Cold War a great setting is that you have this it's almost like the rules of the game are very clearly laid out. And then the literature can sort of correspond with those sort of guide rails, if you like. Having said that, I really enjoy it when writers write about the modern era because, there's this idea that you can't write spy literature in the modern era because everyone has a phone and therefore they're always being tracked. And, there's facial identity technology everywhere. And I sort of think, I understand that does put limitations on writers, but I think in a way that then as writers, we have to find ways around that because we can be sure that spying is still happening.
Yes, and of course, there are lots of good opportunities as well as limitations for writers in the nature of the technological change. And I think you managed to capture that in your book. I've also had a strong preference for Cold War stories because that was a moment of ideological contest on a grand stage. And I think it lends itself really to the dramatic kind of a narrative. But your book and David McCloskey's most recent book, Moscow X, I think, have done better than almost any others of recent times in conveying the sense of moment and urgency of real sort of geopolitical power struggles taking place than any others. So maybe we're at a point where the post-Cold War novel is about to come into its own.
Well, I mean, it's very kind of you to sort of put me alongside David McCloskey. I mean, I think we are clearly at a global level in an era of extraordinary tension. The war in Ukraine is continuing, and a lot of people have sort of turned away from that because of other events in other places. There is an epic conflict with China, which may be a military conflict, it may be an economic conflict, it may be a combination of the both, but that is something which looms in front of all of us. And there are profound questions, I think, about whether the sort of democratic system that we've taken for granted in the so-called West, in the liberal democracies of sort of North America and Europe and mainly, and, a few in the Pacific, obviously, the question about whether this is a sort of sustainable model. And so I think it ought to be the case that it's not about time to write books that, sort of try to deal with those big questions.
One thought that occurred to me reading your book and reading David McCloskey's book, I haven't read Spybrary's book yet, but it's something that I'm just about to do, I think. Given that you're all three former Western intelligence officers, given that the Russians always take the view that there's no such thing as an ex-spy, and given that they assume naturally that everything that comes out of the West is in one form or another a kind of information warfare against them, what do you think the Russians will have made of your book and David McCloskey's book? Because they will certainly have read them.
Well, I love the idea of some SVR officer being told to sit down and work his way through my book, and I hope he enjoyed it, he or she. Well, interesting. I mean, I suppose at risk of sounding a bit self-important, maybe they think that we're onto them and that we have actually started to figure out the way they're doing this. Now, of course, I'm a private citizen. To be clear for those listening in Moscow and everywhere else, no element of this book has any sort of editorial direction from anyone in any official post. I wrote it because I felt like writing it, not because I was being told to do so by some other power. I understand that in Moscow that will be assumed to be just a cynical lie by a perfidious Brit. But yeah, I mean, I think we were playing catch up, to use a term that you used, but we have started to catch up and we are getting better. We're getting better at understanding the insidious nature of what Russia has done. As a result of the Ukraine war, we've got better at doing things like sanctioning, the more egregious elements of the sort of Russian oligarchy. But of course, there's a lot still there. And one of the things I write about in the book, albeit just in a sort of fictional way, is these sort of strange structures of offshore companies and shell companies and all these kinds of things that make it very hard, not just for ordinary citizens, but even for enforcement agencies really to understand whose money is doing what in our system. And I think we need to get better at dealing with that.
Was it on your mind at all when you were writing the book that this would be read in Russia? And did it influence the way that you approached the book? I mean, I know, for example, that the book's going to be published in Ukraine, which, of course, they will again see as being a deliberate move of some kind, who knows what, but they will interpret it in some way, and they certainly won't interpret it as being a kind of a random decision. Was this part of the background of when you were thinking about the book and writing it?
Well, to be honest, no, it wasn't. Well, I think two things. That Russia, on one level, Russia is highly effective. Its intelligence agencies have, for centuries and certainly for decades, carried out all manner of extraordinary things. But sometimes they can be quite incompetent and can be quite, just take the example of the invasion of Ukraine itself. Putin obviously believed that they'd be able to sort of march into Kyiv and no one would stop them. So you have these kinds of, that sort of dichotomy that exists in the Russian system. And, maybe if someone reads my book and thinks that there's a truth underneath it and they go off and waste lots of time trying to find, secret spies buried in their midst, I don't really mind if that happens. That might be amusing. You've mentioned the fact that the book is going to come out in Ukrainian, which of course I'm very excited about. And it's just worth mentioning that, the dedication that the book is dedicated to the people of Ukraine as they continue their fight for freedom. And particularly now with attention perhaps drifting away from that, that's something that means a lot to me personally, but I think it ought to mean a lot to anyone who cares about democracy.
There's a long tradition, obviously, of former intelligence officers, and in one or two cases, serving intelligence officers like John Bingham, who've been novelists, become writers, stretching right back to the earliest days of the genre to now. What do you think it is that explains the way in which former practitioners really sort of dominate the genre in a way that isn't the case in any other genre? What's unique to the relationship between espionage and fiction that makes this happen?
I think there's a few things. One is that it is a very, very interesting and, sort of engaging type of work. And it's one that, if you're on the outside, it's very hard to know much about. So, if you were going to, write a book about war, you might be a soldier, but you can equally get an unbelievable amount of information quite easily about what it's like to be in a war. It's much harder to do that with sort of intelligence work. So I think that's one element of it. I think another element is that for all the intelligence agencies that I know about, the writing of reports is a really important element of it. And that's even for so-called operational officers, that you are not just running around James Bond style. You never see him ever write a report. But in the real world, people have to spend a lot of time putting a lot of effort into communicating clearly what the information, they've received is, or what their source is dealing with, whether there are security threats and all those other sorts of things. So I think, people are perhaps quite well set up to become writers if they've worked in that world.
And also, I suppose, character, that's something that's common both to the intelligence trade and writing, is that eye for detail and character, motivation, what drives people. That must be part of it as well, I think.
Yeah, because, handling an intelligence source is about understanding them and understanding their motivations, understanding the reasons they have for doing what they're doing. And of course, those reasons might include reasons that they might have not to be honest with you, on reasons to mislead you, reasons to betray you. And of course, all of those things, betrayal is such an important element of all intelligence work. And of course, loads of great books are about betrayal, whether they're spy books or not.
Yes, and I suppose that unlike, any other profession, fiction is often the only forum in which intelligence officers or former intelligence officers can talk about what they do because of the constraints of official secrecy that they're bound by even after they've left their services. So that's part of this desire to talk about their world, but in a way that doesn't get them into trouble, like, Compton Mackenzie and others have come a cropper in the past by finding themselves in court for publishing things that they shouldn't have published.
And that's a serious consideration, and, both from one's own peace of mind, but actually, I personally, and I don't know of anyone who would not take seriously their obligations of secrecy, of protecting national security. As readers will discover, my book is about a former intelligence officer. The main intelligence service involved is not a real organization. And, the real intelligence services barely get a mention. And that was deliberate because I wanted people to be very clear that this isn't a disguised version of some real thing that's going on inside MI5 or MI6. This is a work of fiction, which may, I hope, give a lot of feeling of sort of realism, authenticity, but it is a work of fiction.
Are spies avid readers of spy fiction in general, do you find? Is this something that was discussed in the office in the days when you were in the service? Did you talk about fiction with other colleagues, likes, dislikes, that kind of thing?
I think to some extent, John le Carré has such a huge, his shadow looms so enormously over this world. And of course, he was, albeit quite briefly, part of the British intelligence world. And there was often a debate about whether le Carré's books were overall sort of net positive or negative, in the sense that, for the reputation of British intelligence, because if you were going to, on the face of it, you'd say, well, they're very negative, because almost all of le Carré's books have a sort of rather a struggling organization that is very cynical, but also ultimately often sort of gets done over by the Americans or by some other force. You don't read le Carré and feel sort of suddenly, that the Brits are brilliant in the way that sort of James Bond with the Union Jack parachute stuff. But having said all of that, I think le Carré presents a world that is sort of bigger than perhaps the British intelligence really is. It's what you might call a force multiplier. And I think actually that there's a very interesting letter written to The Economist by the former chief of the intelligence service in 2017, Alex Younger, where he makes this point that he sort of argues that the books of people like John le Carré tend to sort of increase the overall sense of influence and potentiality of our intelligence services.
The attitudes to le Carré seem to change a lot over the years. He himself recounts the story of being collared by some former colleague at a cocktail party at some point and being, almost threatened with physical violence over what was deemed to be his unfair portrayal of his former service. But by the end, he sort of had been almost, I would say, not quite adopted, but there was a much more friendly relationship between the intelligence world and le Carré and spy fiction in general. And what was it that you think explains that transformation of attitudes?
Well, I think a lot of it is just sort of maturity on the part of the secret state, because we talk about British soft power, and you've got the BBC World Service, and you've got the Beatles and Premier League football. But also, there is something about a writer who, it's extraordinary, the reach that Le Carré had, because I often read them, I get a lot from them, but I feel that they're very English and maybe even a slightly narrow part of England. Le Carré doesn't really write about working class English people ever. But be that as it may, he manages to reach an amazing global audience. And I think this sort of realization that at the heart of it are flawed but deeply moral people trying to do their best, both for their country and maybe for a higher purpose. I think that exists in a lot of Le Carré's work, and it's easy to understand that people, if they sort of think about it a bit more judiciously, can understand that that is surely good for our country. Not that he was part of some, again, the people in Moscow might think he was part of a complex British soft power operation. He clearly wasn't. He was doing his own thing.
And the character of George Smiley, although you wouldn't describe him as a hero in a conventional sense, there's a nobility about him, which is really one of the reasons why he's such an engaging character. There are reasons why he does what he does. He justifies it, in his own sort of morally anguished way. He justifies it as being a necessary thing. So, in actual fact, I think by the end of the Carla trilogy and the end of the Smiley novels with The Secret Pilgrim, the picture that emerges of British intelligence isn't a particularly hostile one. It's one that's morally complex, but not, I think, deeply antagonistic or one-dimensionally antagonistic. The picture's a much more complex one. Certainly much more complex than the portrayal in A Looking Glass War. I mean, I can understand why there was a reaction against that, because it's so bleakly negative that there is almost nothing redeeming about the portrayal of the intelligence world in that book. But by the later novels, I think it's a very different and more rounded appreciation.
Yeah, I have to agree. Although this is, might be controversial, I actually think A Looking Glass War is his best novel. But, I was thinking also A Perfect Spy is very interesting because, of course, it's a parallel universe. There's no George Smiley, and it's Magnus Pym being this character who is the sort of Kim Philby character, but it's also very clearly John Le Carré. All of his own life story and his conman father are there in the book. And that's, again, very interesting because it's an extremely sympathetic portrayal of this man who's a traitor. It's sympathetic, but it's not telling you that he did the right thing. And I think, again, Le Carré's ability to navigate those really complex moral and ethical questions. Famously, he declined to meet Kim Philby when he made a visit to Moscow. Le Carré declined to meet him. I think it tells us what you need to know, that he was not somebody who sort of, in a slightly kind of delusional way, somehow believed that, Kim Philby had no other choice, which, of course, I think was the name of the book he wrote, or was that George Blake? But ultimately, he understood the ethical dilemmas that these people faced, and understanding isn't the same, of course, as forgiving or excusing.
Yeah, and there was that comment that Le Carré made about, I think he once said in an interview, if he'd stayed in the service, he often wondered whether he'd have become a traitor. And I suppose the Perfect Spy is really sort of the novelization of that thought. Right? Yep. So the alternative life that he would have had if he'd stayed, which I find fascinating. Is writing an ambition that's shared by other former colleagues, do you think, more generally in the British intelligence world? I mean, I was interested in the podcast with I.S. Berry that she said that there's actually a club within the CIA of aspiring writers. I think she called it Invisible Ink. It was the name.
Yeah, that's amazing, isn't it? That there's a CIA writers circle.
Yeah, I just wonder whether there's anything analogous in the UK. I mean, I doubt it, because the culture of the organizations is very different, and everything in Britain is still so buttoned up in some ways and formalized that, and lacking the openness of the American world, that I would doubt it. But is it an ambition you sense that colleagues generally tend to share, or are you an exception?
I'm not going to say I know of lots of people who are planning their books. There are, of course, there are a few former British intelligence officers who have published books. There's James Wolfe, who I think is familiar to many people listening to this podcast. There is Alan Judd from a slightly earlier generation who wrote very good novels. And, it goes on. But I would say, no, I think it's still relatively unusual. And it may be that, part of the reason for it being unusual is that no one really knows if they can or can't do it. And it's very British, the way these things are sort of regulated and dealt with. Clearly in America, you hear I.S. Berry saying that she had her career declassified, and that was clearly a very sort of set out process, but nothing exists in that way in this country.
Have you had any feedback from former colleagues about your book? Have you shared it so far with any of them?
I have a couple, people have enjoyed it, but ultimately I'm not sort of trying to push it under people's noses because I think if they want to read it, they'll find their way to it.
You haven't been threatened at any cocktail parties yet?
Not yet. I'm looking forward to that. So that will be one of the exciting elements of having written this book.
Can I ask whether you think that, in your experience, spy fiction ever influences spy practice? I mean, obviously, there's a relationship the other way. But, it seems to me that the relationship between the genres is very dynamic. It's not a sort of one-way street, to the extent that actually it was fiction that really, in some ways, gave birth to the secret world because of the German spy panic of the early 20th century, started by William Le Queux and others, was what formed part of the pressure for the formation of the Secret Service Bureau. So I'm fascinated by the way that the fiction and reality interact in the spy world. Are you aware of fiction influencing the operations or the culture or the outlook and behavior of the secret world?
Yeah, definitely. I think the thing to remember is that people working in that world have all the same cultural influences that the rest of us have. So when asked to think about secret agents, they will think about James Bond because that is an overwhelming cultural influence that exists in our society. That they will think about the novels of Le Carre. So I think in that sense, it has a strong influence. There is a sort of, it's usually a bit arch with a bit of a raised eyebrow, but the influence of the kind of James Bond culture, and I don't mean in any practical, active way of sort of, licenses to kill, but just the black tie and the sort of glamour and all of that. I think that inevitably it sort of leaches in. And then I think in the sort of Le Carre sense, I think the sort of valorization of sort of intellect and hard graft of really sort of studying a puzzle, I think, again, that has sort of become something that I think is very much sort of appreciated in the world of intelligence.
What are the objects that define espionage?
Right now in my hand is a pen with a hidden microphone.
If you've got a compass that is concealed inside one of the buttons on your jacket, maybe the Germans won't find it.
We're opening the archive and diving deep into their iconic designs.
Enigma is one of the most famous code machines of all time.
I'm Alice Loxton, and this is A History of the World in Spy Objects, a new series from Spyscape Studios. Listen wherever you get your podcasts.
Can I ask about the pitfalls of writing as a former intelligence officer, given the obligations of secrecy regarding sources and methods, and in particular, some things like the portrayal of tradecraft? Obviously, there's a limit to how much you can say about that. When you're describing something like that, does it have to be wholly invented? Or can you, to some extent, refer to things that have a real-world counterpart?
Yeah, I might just draw on something that John Le Carre wrote about his own sort of answer to that question. He said that he wrote something, not that it was authentic, but that it was credible. Now, we could argue about whether those words mean different things or whatever, but I think it's really more about the feeling than the actual practical activities. People could go on the internet and go on YouTube, and there's all kinds of awesome self-described ex-intelligence professionals telling you how to spot you've got a tail, or, the secrets of the spy world. There are so many of those sorts of things around. So in a way, the specific techniques that one might write into a book might not be particularly novel, but I think what I hope someone with my background could bring is the feeling of what it feels like to be trying to think about, am I followed? Have I spotted a follower? Those sorts of things. And so I think that's the way you do it, that it's tradecraft. If you take the James Bond novels, there's always a clever gadget. Certainly from what I know, there's almost never a clever gadget. So it's not about a secret thing that we don't really know about. It's about how it feels and what the sort of human experience is of carrying it out.
I'm told that the KGB actually, dissected the Bond novels with particular attention on the gadgets to try and sort of figure out whether these things were actually being used in some way, or whether they couldn't indeed be invented and used in some way, which always amuses me.
Yeah.
But yeah, I mean, the opening passages of your book describes surveillance,
yeah.
street surveillance procedure, and it describes this thing, the box, which I think has now become a fairly sort of well-known sort of technique for surveilling people at a street level. When the intelligence services read sort of spy novels and they see that these sorts of techniques have really become pretty well known, Did they then have to go back to the drawing board and invent entirely new forms of tradecraft to try and keep one step ahead? How do they deal with the kind of seepage of knowledge about the techniques that they use, which is inevitable, even if it's often done accidentally, actually?
Yeah, I mean, that's absolutely right, that there is seepage of knowledge, and there always will be. And of course, I think arguably it's even more serious when it's on the screen because, it allows people very quickly to see something happening and sort of intuit it. The intelligence services always have to stay ahead of what is widely known. And of course, by definition, it's important that the latest methods and the latest sort of activities remain a secret. As I mentioned, I write in this novel about a protagonist who isn't a member of an intelligence agency. He's a private citizen, albeit one who has that background. So to some extent, what I'm doing is writing about a world that is very present, that there are former intelligence agents who you can hire to surveil someone, as long as they continue to obey the laws. There are people who might teach you, some of those techniques, again, legally, because these are techniques which are already in the public domain.
Yeah, you hit on something there that really interested me about your book, and it's touching on a real-world phenomenon, which is the growth of this world of private intelligence, whether it's driven by corporate interests or it's driven by NGO activism increasingly through entities like Bellingcat and so on. It seems to me that intelligence activity is to some extent being privatized, although that's not really quite the right word. It's now being taken on by non-state agencies and actors in a way that hasn't really been the case in the past. What's driving that? Is that partly because of the difficulties or lack of interest of intelligence services involving themselves in this world of political interference and the constraints that they have, or is it being driven by something else, do you think?
Well, I think that's part of it, that there are, there's a lot of money sloshing around, and that money can buy people with all kinds of skills and, backgrounds in certain techniques and certain abilities. But I think also, you mentioned Bellingcat, and, for listeners who are not familiar, this is a fairly sort of amorphous group of activists who have used open source intelligence, so basically sort of deep internet research, to uncover extraordinary secrets, particularly in the context of Russian activities such as the Salisbury poisonings and so on. Arguably, they've achieved more than intelligence agencies were able to achieve. And in a way, we're living in an age where it used to be that secrets were things that governments had and other governments tried to get them. And I think now secrets are spread all over. There are massive tech businesses that own unbelievable amounts of sensitive data. And there are other people who, of course, are hackers who are trying to get at that data. So I think we're in a much more sort of anarchic world where intelligence isn't just about what's happening in certain government agencies.
It surprises me how little fiction has really engaged with that shift. And your book is really one of the reasons why it's so valuable is it's really the first to take a proper look at it and to describe how that private world of citizen intelligence and corporate intelligence interacts with the official world of spying in secrecy. Do you think that the genre is now going to start looking at that more seriously? Because it certainly needs to be done. It's fertile ground for fiction, I would say.
Well, I hope so. After all, in the sort of classic detective fiction, the private detective is arguably a much more important sort of character than the police detective constable. So perhaps we need that recognition that this world has changed and that therefore the protagonist and the sort of plot lines need to change with it.
Because it's certainly not a passing phenomenon. I think this shift is really sort of a permanent thing. So it'll be an enduring arena for fiction writers, I think. Can I just ask, sort of slightly at a tangent, about spying in film and television and portrayals on the screen of the espionage world? Do you have any particular favorite films or television portrayals of spying? Which do you think capture the mood and reality of that world most effectively? Or which are the most entertaining even?
Yeah, well, I think to name one that we don't hear about very much anymore, but I think was a brilliant film, is Spy Game with Brad Pitt and Robert Redford.
Yes.
And it has these sort of, I think, as a portrayal of a human intelligence relationship. So your Robert Redford is the handler, effectively, and Brad Pitt is the kind of the field agent. I think it's a brilliant movie. And, it's got very high production values. And there's a whole sequence set in Beirut, which is very evocative and so on. Yeah, I enjoyed that a lot. I've enjoyed, in more recent times, very much enjoyed the Slough House adaptations. I think they've they've taken what are very good books and then they've almost made the characters more engaging on the screen, and to my mind, and I suppose it helps when you've got Gary Oldman involved, but it's not just him, there's a whole set of really fun characters. It tends to be on the screen that there's a pressure to make things a bit more sort of exciting and dramatic, and sometimes, of course, there's nothing wrong with that, but sometimes I think it loses something in its ability to sort of portray the world realistically. But there are two other shows I'd mentioned which feature Israel. So one is Fauda. Now, is it espionage? It's perhaps more kind of special operations, but it's the first series of Fauda, which is shot entirely in Arabic and Hebrew, is really, I think, is brilliantly done, and it's a sort of undercover unit operating in Palestinian areas, and perhaps, highly relevant given what's happening in the world at the moment. And then another show with a slightly similar concept, but very much more in the espionage space. It's called Tehran, and it's about Israeli espionage operations inside Iran. And that, I think, is brilliant. I honestly think it in terms of a sort of international espionage thriller, I think it's really, really, really well done. Of course, I haven't mentioned Le Bureau, which, the French one, which is also brilliant. But anyway, everyone knows that one already. But Tehran doesn't seem to have got so much attention. I think it's really worth a look.
And the Bond films, do you still watch those and enjoy them, or do they make you groan?
No, I've always liked Bond films, but, they're nothing to do with the real world. They're amusing, and, I joined everyone had, whether it made sense to kill him off in the most recent one and how they'll bring him back and all that sort of thing. I've always enjoyed Timothy Dalton. Again, unpopular opinions. I think he's an underrated James Bond.
He has a minority of hardcore fans.
There you go.
That's certainly true. Just to finish up, what's next for you? I got a sense at the end of A Spy Alone that you'd sort of set the ground for a sequel. Is this going to be part of a series, a long-running series? Do you have ideas for other series or standalones? What do you think you'll do next?
Well, I'm definitely planning to write a trilogy on this sort of plot world. And of course, there is an Oxford spy ring, and there are plenty at the end of this book that remains unresolved. So that's something I'm sort of actively working on. And in terms of wider things, I mean, I'm always encountering, as I'm sure lots of listeners to this podcast are, I'm always encountering stories in the real world. And you think, gosh, that would make a really interesting novel, or, it sounds like a novel, and those sorts of things. So there's lots to do, just not enough time to write it down.
Well, I'm going to look forward to whatever you produce next, for sure. On the basis of your first book, it's going to be a case of being right to the shop on day of publication to get my hands on a copy, because I really enjoyed A Spy Alone, and I'm very, very grateful to you for joining us for this podcast. So thank you very much, Charles Beaumont.
Well, David, thank you for the opportunity. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks for listening to the Spybrary podcast. You don't have to wait for the next episode. Join the conversation happening now at facebook.com/Spybrary and on Twitter @Spybrary.